Hi everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. In this video I will be summarizing Carl Jung's Black Books, which are these ones. As you can imagine, it's quite a challenge to read through them, and to make a summary is even more challenging. But I'm really excited about it because, as far as I can tell, this will also be the first summary available on YouTube as well. So, as you probably all know, Carl Jung, he has undoubtedly introduced us to an immense array of hugely influential theories and concepts, which can help us to better understand some of the most mysterious aspects of our own psyche. And as Carl Jung himself also indicated, his ideas, they had their origin within his initial fantasies and dreams, which Jung started to document from 1912 onwards. He wrote, "All my works, all my creative activity has come from those initial fantasies and dreams which began in 1912. Up until 2020, Carl Jung's Red Book brought us closest to these initial fantasies and dreams. Now, however, since the publications of Carl Jung's Black Books at the end of 2020 by the editor Sonu Shamdasani, we can come even closer and, in effect, read these initial fantasies and dreams in its entirety on our own. So whereas the Red Book only encompasses material written between 1913 and 1916, the Black Books, they consist of 7 volumes written between 1913 and 1932. So in this sense, one can consider the Black Books an extension of the Red Book in a way. And as the editor indicated at the back of the book set as well, the Black Books, they were the most important unpublished work written by Carl Jung up until that point. So in this summary of the Black Books, I've summarized the most important ideas which can be found throughout the Black Books, and I've also previously made separate summaries and analysis of each volume. So if you're interested in them as well, I will link them below this video in the description. And although this is merely a summary of the Black Books, I feel that when dealing with the work of Carl Jung, there's a certain amount of personal interpretation necessary, which is also why the summary sometimes includes some of my own interpretations of Jung works. So please also let me know in the comments what you thought about it, and if you have any different interpretations, then please also let me know. So the first volume of the Black Books consists of an introduction written by the editor, Sonu Shamdasani, and it replaced the original first volume, which was written by Carl Jung when he was still a child, and therefore it is also considered to be of less interest to us. And throughout the introduction, it is explained why and how Carl Jung wrote the Black Books. So shortly prior to World War I, several visions were presented to Carl Jung, visions in which Europe was being flooded by a river of blood, and at first Jung believed that he might be going insane. However, when his visions actually became reality, he believed that he might, in fact, not be going insane, and was interested in finding the origin of these visions. And since visions, such as the ones presented to Jung, were widespread throughout Europe at the time and could even be found in art and literature, Jung came to believe that these visions might have their origin in a certain collective unconscious. The editor wrote, "In Jung's view, his undertaking pertained not just to himself but to others as well. He had come to view his fantasies as stemming from a general, metaphoric layer of the psyche, which he named the collective unconscious." So Carl Jung, he argued that it is extremely important for an individual to become aware of this collective unconscious as well as the individual's own private unconscious. Jung would later call this process individuation. Jung even argued that such a process could prevent events similar to World War I from happening. According to Jung, even though wars are fought between nations, there's a strong connection between the nature of the individual representing the nation and the nation itself. In the psychology of the unconscious processes, Jung wrote, "Only the change in the attitude of the individual is the beginning of the change in the psychology of the nation. The great problems of humanity will never be solved through general laws, but always only through the renewal of the attitude of the individual." So the editor Shamdasani observed in the introduction that, according to Jung, the origins of the outbreak of World War I could be found in certain repressed, irrational ideas. So after the French Revolution, these irrational religious ideas and other beliefs, they lost their dominance, and this resulted in a certain repression. So the editor wrote, "It was thus a historical necessity to acknowledge the irrational as a psychological factor. The acceptance of the irrational forms one of the central undertakings in the Black Books." In this sense, one of the main purposes of the Black Books was for Jung to have an outlet for his own irrational dispositions. And in the end, these irrational tendencies could be connected to an individual's rational side, resulting in a more integrated individual. And eventually this would also, according to Jung, benefit society as a whole. Jung believed that symbols were extremely important in this regard. Symbols, according to Jung, were able to serve as a bridge between the rational and the irrational, so a bridge between the conscious and the unconscious worlds. The editor wrote, "Symbols," he argued, "stem from the unconscious, and the creation of symbols was the most important function of the unconscious. While the compensatory function of the unconscious was always present, the symbol-creating function was only present when we were willing to recognize it." The symbol-creating function was explored by Jung throughout the Red Book, but also throughout the Black Books. Jung observed that the unconscious, or the irrational, and the conscious, or the rational, exist in two separate dimensions. In the Red Books, these are defined as the spirit of the times and the spirit of the depths. The spirit of the times is the rational dimension in which we live our day-to-day lives, according to Jung. And throughout the Black Books, Jung attempted to explore the irrational and unconscious spirit of the depths, and attempted to translate what he learned from this exploration into the language of the spirit of the times, so that we could also understand it. And for this translation, certain symbols are essential, according to Jung. So Jung argued that the ultimate goal of the process of individuation was the development and the exploration of the self. So the self, according to Jung, is the entirety of an individual's personality, so the combination of the conscious personality, which we also call the ego, and the unconscious personality. And in order to reach this goal, a certain communication between the conscious and the unconscious would be necessary. And for this purpose, Jung proposed the engagement of certain inner dialogues through active imagination. So the editor wrote, "Everyone," he claimed, "had this ability to hold dialogues with himself." Active imagination would thus be one form of inner dialogue, a type of dramatized thinking. And this is also how Jung wrote the Black Books, which represent in essence a dialogue between Jung's conscious and unconscious. So this exploration was not really an easy endeavor for Carl Jung, and at the beginning of the second volume of the Black Books, Jung wrote the following. He wrote, "A huge task lay before me. I saw its enormous size, and its value and meaning escaped me. I got into the dark and I groped along my path. That path led inward and downward." I believe that for Carl Jung, this huge task was not just the exploration of his own unconscious, but also a correct documentation of this exploration which he could share with the world. And Jung attempted to communicate with his soul, and at the beginning, however, this was also rather difficult. And Jung believed that he might have ignored his own soul for too long, because he was focused too much on the external world. He wrote, "I wandered for 11 years, so long that I forgot that I possessed a soul that I could call my own. I belonged to men and things. I did not belong to myself." A main theme represented at the beginning of the Black Books is the idea that in order to discover one's soul, one must focus on the internal world. And the exploration of the depths of the internal world even terrified Jung at first. He wrote, "What torture! I must return to myself, to my smallest things. I want to be careful and say, I had learned to see other things as large and had compared those with the things of my soul and had discovered that they were small. You force me to see them as large, to make them large. Is that your aim? I follow, but it terrifies me." Jung also struggled to really trust his soul, which he personally considered strange because he could easily trust other people. Then why could he not trust his own soul? He wrote, "Do I not trust every valiant man, every honorable woman, and not you, my soul?" As a result, Jung decided that the only way forward was for him to lay all his trust with his soul. He wrote, "Your hand lies heavy on me, but I am willing. I am willing. I have not rendered my best to love man and trust him, and should I not render this to you, my own soul, or rather, the soul by which I am owned? Yes, I see how you guide me. I recognize your wise schooling. You convince me, and I follow." So after this decision, Jung's adventure into the depths of his unconscious really commences. Despite the personal nature of this journey, it seems strangely relatable, which makes the existence of some sort of collective unconscious even more convincing. The initial stages of Jung's journey, they do not go as smoothly as Jung had hoped. For example, Carl Jung came to the realization that his soul is a desert. He wrote, "My soul leads me into the desert of my own soul. I did not think that my soul is a desert, and yet it seems to be the case. The journey leads through hot sand. slowly waiting without a visible goal to hope for. However, as Jung observed in the Red Book, this is only normal and it's up to us to fertilize this desert of the soul. Jung wrote, "If your creative force now turns to the place of the soul, you will see how your soul becomes green and how its fields bear wonderful fruit." Furthermore, Jung he also became convinced that his own thoughts formed some sort of limitation. He wrote, "You are hard, my soul, but you are right. How little adept we are at living. We should grow like a tree that likewise does not know its law. We tie ourselves up with intentions, not mindful of the fact that intention is the limitation. Yes, the exclusion of life." Therefore, throughout the second volume of the Black Books, Jung became increasingly convinced that one should prevent to limit the scope of one's journey through any sort of intentions which one could set at the beginning of the journey. Jung wrote, "We believe that we can illuminate the darkness with an intention and in that way aim past the light. How can we presume to want to know in advance from where the light will come to us?" So we can clearly observe how Carl Jung was taking a step away from knowledge and reason towards the unknown and perhaps even irrational. Jung decided to forego any intentions and even any knowledge which he believed he had about the unconscious world. He wrote, "But our knowledge, does our knowledge also not hold good for you? What is going to be, if not knowledge? Where is security? Where is ground? Where is firm land? Where is light?" So despite his conviction to go forward with his investigation, Jung was worried that his kind of unscientific research would benefit no one because his observations would be merely valid for himself. He wrote, "I find the thought that this must occur only for me agonizing, and that perhaps no one will gain insight from my work, but my soul demands this achievement." Luckily for us, this was of course not the case, and as Jung himself would later indicate as well, all of his most important ideas, they had their origin within this exploration throughout the Black Books. So after this initial darkness which Jung found in his own unconscious, he began to discover that there are certain characters living within the depths of his unconscious. And the Black Books, they are full of interactions with these figures, and these include, for example, Philemon, Elijah, Salome, and Isdobar. In this summary, I will not go into these figures into too much detail, but it's worth to mention that these figures, they form an important part in Jung's discovery of his own unconscious. At the same time, they also illustrate the distance between the conscious and the unconscious worlds. So throughout the third volume of the Black Books, for example, Jung had a long interaction with one of these characters called Isdobar. And Isdobar, he's struck by the scientific truths which Jung shares with him. And Isdobar even considered these truths to be poisonous. He wrote, "O Isdobar, most powerful one, what you call poison is science. In our country we are nurtured on it from youth. And that may be one reason why we haven't properly flourished and remained so dwarfish. When I see you, however, it seems to me as if we are all somewhat poisoned." After a long discussion that follows, Jung and Isdobar, they conclude that there must exist two kinds of truth. One truth stemming from the internal world and one from the outer world. He wrote, "All truth is that which comes to us from the knowledge of outer things. The truth of your priest is that which comes to you from inner things, of the human spirit." Eventually, the scientific truths from Carl Jung, they are so poisonous to the figure of Isdobar that they eventually lame Isdobar. And this brings Jung to the conclusion that we humans have no other choice but to accept the truths of the external world, for they might otherwise lame us as well. He wrote, "Now you perhaps see that we had no choice. We have to swallow the poison of science, otherwise we meet the same fate as you have. We will be completely lamed, if we encounter it unsuspecting and unprepared. This poison is so insurmountably strong that everyone, even the strongest and even the eternal gods, perish because of it." I believe that Carl Jung made an extremely interesting argument in relation to this discussion. Jung argued that these scientific truths, poisonous to the figure of Isdobar, can become problematic to us as well. And this is the case because the possibilities within our conscious world have become almost limitless, creating the risk that we are swallowed up by too many possibilities. Jung wrote, "Just as the concrete world has expanded from the limitedness of the ancient outlook to the immeasurable diversity of our modern outlook, the world of intellectual possibilities has developed to unfathomable diversity. As a result, according to Jung, no one will be able to understand the entirety of life on his or her own. He wrote, "Infinitely long paths, paved with thousands of thick volumes, lead from one specialization to another. Soon no one will be able to walk down these paths anymore, and then only specialists will remain." Therefore, Jung indicated that an overarching principle which can provide some sort of guidance might be a necessity. He wrote, "Our time requires something capable of regulating the mind. More than ever, we require the living truth of the life of the mind, of something capable of providing firm guidance." So according to Jung, the existence of evil is one such aspect of life for which our conscious mind requires a certain guidance. Science has, so far, according to Jung, not proven a match against the existence of evil, and it can even be argued that science has increased the amount of evil in the world to some degree. And close to the end of the third volume of the Black Books, Jung observed that he had been paying too little attention to the existence of evil. He wrote, "Evil, I thought too little about evil. Evil exists too. Evil, the abysmal evil, is not to be forgotten. There is no scientific cover-up for it. Even the word evil is commonplace, but not a thing per se." This discussion on evil can, in my opinion, also be considered the source of one of Jung's most famous ideas, finding that which one needs by looking at the place where one least wants to look. Jung wrote, "Here lies an inner reluctance. What is it I do not want to see?" So 2 decisions of Jung gave him the opportunity to have these interactions with his unconscious, which he was seeking. So number 1, foregoing the reliance on scientific truths, and 2, looking at the places where he least wanted to look. At the start of the 4th volume of the Black Books, Carl Jung has an interesting interaction with a librarian about the ideas of Friedrich Nietzsche. According to the librarian, although religions may have lost their importance to a certain degree, authors such as Nietzsche have been writing their own books of prayer, which have been able to fill the void to some degree. And in the case of Nietzsche, this was of course Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And Carl Jung, he agrees with the librarian. However, Jung argues that the philosophy of Nietzsche can only fill the void for a certain group of people. And according to Jung, Nietzsche's philosophy is only interesting for those that live a life which is too constrained and require more freedom and independence. He wrote, "Nietzsche's truth strikes me as too agitated and provocative. It's good for those who are yet to be set free." According to Jung, another group of people, those that might perhaps be too free in a sense, they need a different philosophy, a philosophy that provides a form of resignation and sets certain boundaries. He wrote, "I've recently discovered that we also need a truth for those who need constraint. It is possible that instead they need a depressive truth, which makes men smaller and more inward." And although it's not really important for the summary of the Black Books, I believe it is interesting to mention that Jung explored such a philosophy for those for whom the ideas of Nietzsche are less relevant, whereas Nietzsche's philosophy is directed at making men feel more worthy and motivating men to remove the shackles imposed upon them by religion and society. Jung was in several ways developing a philosophy which made men feel humbler, a philosophy which addresses their imperfections. However, as soon as those belonging to this group acknowledged these inferiorities and imperfections in relation to the overwhelming power of their own unconscious and their own soul, this humbling factor could turn out to be empowering as well. For example, in the 4th volume of the Black Books, Jung invited men to recognize and embrace madness. He wrote, "Let the light of your madness shine, and it will suddenly dawn on you. Madness is not to be despised and not to be feared, but instead you should give it life." Jung believed that everyone was filled with a certain form of madness, and the sooner this is recognized by the individual, the better, according to Jung. He wrote, "Man strives toward reason only so that he can make rules for himself. Life itself has no rules. That is its mystery. What you call knowledge is your attempt to impose something comprehensible on life." In this sense, I believe it is possible to argue that Jung managed to explore a philosophy which is a great addition to the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, whereas Nietzsche's philosophy is great at empowering the individual by indicating how he or she can become more powerful and independent, which is of great significance, which is of course of great significance to some. Jung's philosophy is to a large extent aimed at indicating how powerless and insignificant an individual can be. In line with this discussion, Jung invited everyone to embrace all aspects of life, also those which our present society might not be eager to accept. He wrote, "Life should proceed from birth to death and from death to birth, from sense to madness and from madness to sense, unbroken like the path of the sun. Everything should proceed on this path. At heart, this is also what the Black Books are all about. The interactions which Jung was having with figures of his own unconscious will in our society be considered a form of madness. And Jung recognized this as well and indicated that despite the form of madness which he was exploring, he tried his best to live a normal life outwardly. He wrote, "The after I walk on like a man who is tense, and who expects something new that he has never suspected before. I listen to the depths, warned, instructed, and undaunted, outwardly striving to lead a full human life." Resulting from these thoughts and convictions, Jung, as he delved deeper into the writings of the Black Books, became more willing to accept the way of his soul. He wrote, "I will gratefully accept what you give me, my soul. I do not have the right to judge or reject. Fate will separate the wheat from the chaff. We have to subjugate ourselves also to the judgment of valuelessness and destruction, majorem vitae gloriam." This forms a strong contrast compared to the reluctance which Jung showed at the beginning of the Black Books to trust his soul. However, despite the progress Jung considered he was making, his soul indicated that this was only the beginning. This observation of Jung's soul made Jung uncertain. Jung's unconsciousness pointed out to him that everyone could go on a similar endeavor as Jung, but that the price might be too hard to pay for some. He wrote, "Everyone has the ability to find out what is taking place, but not everyone can afford to pay the price. It's quite exhausting." Jung became uncertain about whether the price he was paying, a form of madness, was actually worth it. He wrote, "The uncertainty and unpredictability are difficult to bear. Naturally, but who says it is an easy load to carry, if one wants to create the future and not just live it? This uncertainty is, however, inevitable." Jung wrote, "Even the value of what you do is doubtful, inevitably so, because you have no means to judge the value of present things in any way. That only manifests itself later if things are of value at all. One needs to live with uncertainty." And this uncertainty is addressed by Jung through a conversation which he had with a shepherd at the end of the 4th volume of the Black Books. Jung asked the shepherd, who was living a life far removed from civilization, whether he did not mind that, living life as he does, he's missing out on living life to the fullest of his potential. The shepherd responded by indicating that it is actually through the primitiveness and sometimes harshness of the life that he is living that he acquires more than enough meaning. He wrote, "You might be right, but this wonderful free life, one can't let it go. Life in the cities means deformity, one more or less in civilization. What difference does the individual make? Moreover, according to the shepherd, if people were true to themselves, more people would live their lives as he does." He wrote, "How many cowards and weaklings do you have among your cultural laborers, who participate only because of their cowardice and weakness, but at heart would like to do something else, if their anxiety would permit them." So the shepherd enjoys the simplicity of life and the possibility for him, which he would not have had in the city, to actually complete something and be fulfilled, as opposed to the limited possibilities in the city. Jung wrote, "I returned back to the finite, back to the limited human life, where the task and the life burn out together. I threw off the impossible and came back to the possible." I believe that this interaction convinced Jung that he was not wasting his time by partly withdrawing from society and living his life, his inner life at least, as a shepherd. Jung wrote, "If you are simply a man, creating is over. For the sake of your work, you must be a child and leave him the crown." A main theme present throughout the 5th volume of the Black Books is Carl Jung's confrontation with the darker side of his own personality. For example, Jung's unconscious confronted him with the following: "You gloatingly leave others in the lurch, if they only get caught in your snares. You exploit their naivety in order to present yourself wiser and superior. You play at modesty and do not mention your merit, in the certain hope that someone else will do it for you. You are disappointed and withdraw hurt if this doesn't happen." Such an observation is quite confrontational. However, it convinced Jung of the existence of a shadow existing within one's unconscious. A shadow which is composed of all the darker sides of one's personality, which one desperately attempts to hide from him or herself, and especially from society. According to Jung, while exploring one's unconscious, one will inevitably be confronted by one's shadow. And later, in the archetypes of the collective unconscious, Jung would define the idea of the shadow more clearly. He wrote, "Whoever looks into the mirror of the water will see first of all his own image. Whoever goes to himself risks a confrontation with himself. The mirror does not flatter. It faithfully shows whatever looks into it, namely the face we never show to the world because we cover it with the persona, the mask of the actor, but the mirror lies behind the mask and shows the true face. I believe, however, that the source of this idea can be found within the Black Books as well. Jung argued that the confrontation with the shadow is a true test, which is an inevitable part of the exploration of the unconscious. It might be too confrontational for some, however the only alternative is to continue to project one's shadow upon one's environment. Jung wrote, "For the meeting with ourselves belongs to the more unpleasant things that can be avoided, as long as one can project everything negative into the environment." And several years later, in his book Aeon, Jung would argue that such unresolved conflicts within the individual would actually end up negatively impacting society as a whole. He wrote, "The psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside, as fate. That is to say, when the individual remains undivided and does not become conscious of his inner opposite, the world must perforce act out the conflict and be born into opposing halves." So until the beginning of the 6th volume of the Black Books, most discussions can be characterized by an exploration of opposites, for example good and evil, consciousness and unconsciousness, shadow and light, etc. At the beginning of the 6th volume of the Black Books, Jung started to attempt to find a way to unite these opposites, to find an overarching principle. And for this purpose, Jung introduces the idea of the Pleroma. And in order to avoid a lengthy discussion, I will not go into too much detail about the Pleroma. I've made a separate video about the Pleroma, which you can see somewhere on your screen right now as well, if you're interested in a more elaborate description of the Pleroma. So for now, I would just like to provide you with the following definition, which Jung provides us. He wrote, "That which is endless and eternal has no qualities, since it has all qualities. We call this nothingness or fullness the Pleroma. Therein both thinking and being cease, since the eternal and endless possess no qualities. No one is in it, for he would then be distinct from the Pleroma, and would possess qualities that would distinguish him as something distinct from the Pleroma. I believe that the Pleroma can be seen as some kind of supreme essence of everything that has been, will be, and is. However, as soon as anything comes into existence, it will have developed its own identity, and consequently, it will separate itself from the Pleroma. So I believe in this sense we can compare the idea of the Pleroma to, for example, the idea of God, Mother Nature, or any other kind of supreme authority. Jung wrote, "But we are the Pleroma, for we are enclosed in and part of the eternal and the endless, but we have no share therein, as we are infinitely removed from the Pleroma, not spatially or temporally, but essentially, since we are distinguished from the Pleroma in our essence as creation, which is confined within time and space." And you might wonder what the purpose of such a vague term as the Pleroma might be. However, interestingly, Jung observed that it is exactly this vagueness which gives the term its purpose. The fact that we can talk about the Pleroma and therefore differentiate ourselves from it indicates to us that we exist as a separate entity. Jung wrote, "When we distinguish the qualities of the Pleroma, we are speaking from the ground of our own differentiated state and about our own differentiation, but have effectively said nothing about the Pleroma. Yet we need to speak about our own differentiation, so that we may sufficiently differentiate ourselves." And this differentiation, according to Jung, is the essence of the individual. And the more an individual can differentiate itself from the world around him, the more an individual is an individual. Jung wrote, "If we do not differentiate, we move beyond our essence, beyond creation, and we fall into non-differentiation. We fall into the Pleroma itself and cease to be created being. We lapse into dissolution in eternity and endlessness. This is the death of the creature. Therefore we die to the same extent that we do not differentiate. Hence the creature's essence strives toward differentiation. This is called the principium individuationis. So whether we up until this point understand what the idea of the Pleroma entails or not, the important point for us to take away from this discussion on the Pleroma is that we should be careful not to fall prey to the spell of the Pleroma. And as I mentioned, Carl Jung, up until this point in the Black Books, he attempted to explore several opposites, good and evil, consciousness, unconsciousness, etc. And in light of the idea of the Pleroma, according to Jung, as soon as one attempts to explore one of these opposites, one will fall prey to the spell of the Pleroma, because one of these opposites cannot be without the other. Jung wrote, "When we strive for the good or the beautiful, we forget our essence, which is differentiation, and we fall subject to the spell of the qualities of the Pleroma, which are the pairs of opposites. We endeavor to attain the good and the beautiful, Yet at the same time we also seize the evil and the ugly, since in the Pleroma these are one with the good and the beautiful. So the way to remedy this, according to Jung, is to always stay true to our own unique essence, and thereby move beyond these pairs of opposites, as Nietzsche did, for example, move beyond good and evil. Jung wrote, "If we do the same in the name and under the sign of our essence, which is differentiation, we differentiate ourselves from the good and the beautiful, and hence from the evil and the ugly, and thus we do not fall prey to the spell of the Pleroma." I believe that most of Jung's work was focused on this idea of the principium individuationis, the pursuit of one's true essence. Jung wrote, "At bottom, therefore, there is only one striving, namely the striving for the essence in you. If you had this striving, you would not need to know anything about the Pleroma and its qualities, and yet you would attain the right goal by virtue of your own essence. Since, however, thought alienates us from our essence, I must teach you that knowledge with which you can bridle your thoughts." The idea of the Pleroma, however complicated it can be, illustrates what happens when one does not pursue one's own essence. One falls prey to the Pleroma, and in the sense ceases to be an individual. So throughout the last volume of the Black Books, volume 7, Jung brings all of these ideas to a conclusion. Jung comes to accept all of his deficiencies and concludes that he is not perfect and will never be perfect, which is alright. Jung wrote, "This man errs and you exist. That is why you are always present, since man always errs. Why must he err? He is a starseed. He errs through the unlimited. He fell down from the unknown. He continues to err. His errancy is his truth. He would do well to know it. Through errancy he lives." In a sense, I believe that this acceptance of oneself, even one's imperfections, so one's shadow, for example, forms the essence of the journey which was documented in the Black Books by Carl Jung. Initially, one must, through rigorous self-exploration, get to know all the aspects of one's own identity, most notably the unconscious aspects which have potentially been ignored for a long time. And this might be a long and tiresome and difficult struggle, as we can clearly see from Jung's journey as well. And one might be confronted with some horrendous internal struggles and be faced with the darkness and emptiness of one's own internal desert. However, eventually, by turning inwards, one might be able to fertilize this desert. Or as I quoted earlier, "If your creative force now turns to the place of the soul, you will see how your soul becomes green and how its field bears wonderful fruit." It's important, according to Jung, however, that after one has turned one's creative force inwards, one eventually accepts all that one encounters and moves out again into the conscious world with the full acceptance of oneself as a truly unique individual with his or her own unique values, interests, and shortcomings. So thank you very much for watching this video. I hope it was worth your time and that you've learned something from it. Please let me know in the comments what you thought about this video, whether you have any suggestions or whether you have any other ideas about what Carl Jung actually wrote in the Black Books. If you like this kind of topics as well, then please also consider subscribing. I will try to make a video at least once every week. So thank you very much and have a nice day.